All right, everyone. We are so excited to have somebody that I consider an absolute guru. And I use that word with a lot of respect whenever I think of somebody who's done such phenomenal work to make the field of research, especially around diabetes, go forward and to make sure that they're able to simplify topics, to explain them in a way that is easy to understand. So I'm delighted to have Dr. Cyrus Kambata on. I can't wait to talk to you today. You know, a little bit about you, and I'm going to brag a little bit here, but you have this phenomenal book on mastering diabetes. It's a New York Times bestseller. I can't wait to get my hands on it. So as soon as this thing is done, that's the first thing I'm doing is going and reading it. You know, we
Awesome.
had a chance to speak at a couple of conferences where I got to see you speak. You're phenomenal, really.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. The feeling's right back at you because when we originally met each other at an ACLM conference and I saw you talk, I literally wrote down every single possible word I could take notes on, and I thought to myself, wow, this guy really knows his stuff when it comes to kidney health.
Well, I appreciate that. And, you know, today, what I really wanted to talk about was this issue of diabetes. And, you know, diabetes, I'm trained as a kidney specialist. So the number one cause of kidney disease, the number one is diabetes. You can look at everything else. You can look at autoimmune conditions. You can look at hypertension. You can look at obesity, but you'll always come back to diabetes. And the issue that keeps coming up with diabetes is everybody wants to know, how do we get over it? But before we even dive into it, I know you have a phenomenal story about your own personal life and sort of how you've dealt with your own illness. Tell us a little bit about that if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I totally appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Uh, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 22. So I was a senior in college and I was going to Stanford University and I was just trying to graduate and move on with my life. And out of the blue, I started to feel really strange. And when I say strange, the first symptom that I had was just excessive thirst. I mean, I've always been an athlete. I've always had a voracious appetite and I've always drank plenty of liquids. But to go from drinking, 5, 6, 7, 8 cups of water per day to triple that, within a 24-hour period, I knew something was very wrong. So I was drinking, conservatively 1 gallon, sometimes upwards of 1.5, maybe even 2 gallons of water. And it seemed like every time I took a drink of water and put the cup down, within 5 seconds, I was like, I'm thirstier. I just got thirsty by drinking water. And this process kept on happening over and over again. In addition to that, I was also urinating very frequently because the volume of fluids that I was taking on was so large that I ended up having to go to the bathroom every 30 minutes or so, like clockwork. And then in addition to that, I also started to flush electrolytes. So when I would go to sleep, I would lay in bed and my muscles would cramp very quickly. So you've probably been in that situation where you're lying in bed and all of a sudden your calf cramps and you wake up and you're like, oh wow, I got to get rid of that calf cramp, right? So my calf would cramp on one side and then I would sort of like try and relieve the stress inside of that muscle, and in so doing I would cramp my left butt cheek, and then in trying to relieve the tension in both of those muscles I would end up cramping an ab and then a shoulder and then a chest, and before I knew it there were certain times where I was lying in bed in what felt like full body rigor mortis, and I just had to surrender, and I was like, I cannot understand why this is happening to me. So 2 days of this went by. I picked up the phone. I called my sister, and she's a doctor of osteopathy, family practice in Davis, California. And I said to her, I said, Shanaz, can you please explain to me what is happening here? And so I gave her all my symptomology. Shanaz is a very cool cookie. She's very smart, and she knew immediately. She said, Cyrus, drop everything that you're doing right now. Go straight to the hospital or straight to the medical center. You have type 1 diabetes. Those are all the symptoms. And I was like, type 1 diabetes? What are you talking about? No, 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 no. I'm Shanaz. Like, Shanaz, I'm an athlete, right? I don't have diabetes. Like, I literally thought that diabetes was only something that happened to old people who ate cake. That's it. And so I'm young, I'm fit, I'm not overweight. This doesn't make any sense. And she said, I don't have time to explain. Just go. So I go straight to the health center. I check myself in. A nurse meets me. She checks my blood glucose. She walks out of the room to put in a glucometer. She comes back 3 or 4 minutes later. I'm passed out. She opens the door. I wake up and I look up at the ceiling and I go, okay, I'm in a health center. How did I get here? Okay, I walked here. Who is that? Okay, that's a nurse. What is she doing in this room? Oh, okay, she has some information for me. She looks at me. She goes, how did you get here? And I said, I walked. And she was like, we need to get you to the hospital right now. And I was like, could you, someone please explain to me what's happening? And she said, your blood glucose is supposed to be between about 70 and 130. Okay, so average of about 100. Your blood glucose is in the 600s right now. And I said, why is it so high? She goes, I don't know. But all we got to do is get you straight to the hospital. So they took me to the hospital. While I was there, they ended up giving me an IV of saline into one arm. And then they gave me an IV of insulin. And over the course of the next 24 hours, they were able to lower my blood glucose from 600 all the way down to approximately 200 or so. They didn't want to go too much lower than that. So they just brought it down using insulin. And then while I was in the hospital, they did a little bit of detective work. And they started to unfold my health history that nobody had given attention to before. And what they helped me figure out was over the course of the preceding 6 months, I had also developed 2 other autoimmune conditions. So now I was living with 3 autoimmune conditions. The first one was Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. So that's, insufficient thyroid production. Number 2 was alopecia universalis, which, as you can see, I have no hair, I have no eyelashes, no eyebrows. I literally have 0 hair on my body. And then number 3 was type 1 diabetes, autoimmune. So you can imagine at the age of 22, getting diagnosed with 3 autoimmune conditions within a 6-month period. That's a little unnerving. So I didn't know anything about health. And I was like, okay, did I do this? Like, is this my fault? Am I doing something incorrectly? Or am I just sort of like a victim of bad genes? And so the doctors couldn't really give me an explanation. All they could tell me is they said, listen, when it comes to living with diabetes, the most effective solution is to eat a low carbohydrate diet. And I said, why? And they said, here's why. When you lower your carbohydrate intake, you lower the chances of your blood glucose going high after you eat a meal. So people living with all forms of diabetes, especially type 1 diabetes, we recommend that they eat a low carbohydrate diet because, as they said in quotes, carbs make your blood sugar spike. That was the sort of message that I kept on hearing over and over and over again. So I developed this idea, okay, carbohydrates equal bad. Carbohydrates equal not good for Cyrus anymore. And so as a result of that, I started to eat a low carbohydrate diet with turkey burgers and milk and cheese and red meat and white meat and chicken and, trying to go for lean cuts of meat, but trying to avoid also fruits and potatoes and breads and pastas and cereals and anything that, contains carbohydrate. So I did that for a year. And Dr. Hashmi, I can't even tell you it was so obvious to me so quickly into this process that this was not the right approach because, again, eating a low carbohydrate diet was supposed to keep my blood glucose nice and stable. So what that means is that I should be able to check my blood glucose, 5, 6, 7, 10 times a day. And the number should be somewhere around 100, maybe 100, 120, 130, 150. But when I checked my blood glucose was just ping-ponging. It was ping-ponging between 350 and 50. And on any given moment, I would check my blood glucose and it literally felt like I was sticking a blood glucose meter into a random number generator. I had no idea what my blood glucose was going to be. And so, when you're living with a blood glucose, control problem, any form of diabetes or prediabetes, and your blood glucose is bouncing around, let me tell you, it drains everything out of you. It drains your physical energy. It drains your mental energy. It drains your emotional energy. You start to beat yourself up. You start to say, oh, I'm not smart enough. I can't figure this out. Something's wrong with me. I'm broken. So it becomes a mental preoccupation. But then in addition to that, when your glucose is bouncing all over the place, it'll zap your energy when you're super low. And then when you're super high, it'll make you extremely thirsty and it'll zap your energy again. So this process was going on for about a year. And at a certain point, I was like, you know what? I got to change something. So long story short, I ended up transitioning to a plant-based diet just out of, pure circumstance. I just ended up talking to some people who knew some people who introduced me to a guy who taught me how to eat a plant-based diet. And within 1 week of eating a low-fat plant-based whole food diet, literally full of fruits and vegetables, my carbohydrate intake went from being about 100 grams of carbohydrate per day on a low carbohydrate diet to 600 grams of carbohydrate per day, right? So I six-tupled my carbohydrate intake. And I was afraid that my insulin use would also go up, if not double, triple, quadruple, something like that. But what ended up happening was that my carbohydrate intake went up by 6-fold and my insulin use went down. Okay, this was fascinating to me. So my insulin, yeah, go ahead.
When you say carbohydrates, and this is an important question that comes up a lot, is tell me what kind of carbohydrates were you eating?
Very good question. Very glad you talked on this. Okay. So in the world of, in the world of pop science, I'll say, and in the world of sort of like public health, people have become very afraid of this term called carbs. And so you see it all over the place. Eat a low carb diet. Carbs are bad for you. Carbs will cause digestive inflammation. Carbs will increase your cholesterol. They will increase your glucose, your risk for diabetes, and they will make you obese. You see this all over the place. But really what the public health world should do, in my opinion, is preface the word carbs with another word, and then that other word should be refined. So if they said, limit your refined carbohydrate intake, nobody's going to argue with that. That is a perfectly valid, scientifically valid message. The refined carbohydrates that they should be referring to are things that come in packages and cans. Cookies, crackers, chips, waffles, sodas, Bear Claws, sugar-sweetened beverages, Gatorade, things like that, right? These are all manufactured products, and they oftentimes contain high fructose corn syrup or added dextrose or some version of an artificial sweetener. But there's another class of carbohydrates which nobody, in my professional opinion, or very few people, should be limiting. And those class of carbohydrates are not refined, they are whole carbohydrates. And so whole carbohydrates don't come from packages and cans and bottles. They come from real food. They come from fruits. They come from starchy vegetables. They come from legumes, and they come from whole grains. So when I transitioned, I started eating fruits and vegetables. That was it. I didn't even venture into legume or starchy vegetable territory. I literally was just eating fruits and vegetables. And by doing that, my carbohydrate intake six-folded, and my insulin use came down by 40%. So I was fascinated by this experiment that was underway in my body. And I said, you know what? I want to be able to understand the science here, because at heart, I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, and I like to understand, I like to tinker and try and find out how things actually work. And so I put myself back to graduate school to go get a PhD in nutritional biochemistry so that I could really understand the nitty-gritty details of the molecular biology of what's happening in my pancreas and my liver tissue and my muscle tissue and my thyroid gland and my brain, and how are all these tissues communicating with each other. And in so doing, while I was at UC Berkeley for 5 years, I uncovered almost 100 years worth of scientific data that dates back to the 1920s that clearly describes not only what happened inside of me living with type 1 diabetes, but clearly describes the incredible effect of lowering saturated fat intake and increasing plant intake for people living with all forms of diabetes. And once I read that information, this light bulbs went off in my head, and I was like, you know what? I understand it. The scientific world has a very good grasp on the power of a plant-based diet. But the public health world, what people do in the real world, is the exact opposite. There's a giant wall. The scientific research is very clear. The public is doing the exact opposite. And so I decided that I wanted to get involved in this world and try and teach people who are living with any form of diabetes, type 1, 1.5, prediabetes, type 2, gestational, how they can transition to a plant-based diet so they can also get similar effects, if not completely better.
So tell me, what's interesting is you have people on one side who are researchers, and then you have the general public.
Right.
And the conduit between these two arms is what really delivers what type of message. So there may be a research study that says, white flour is bad for you. But by the time it comes out, it's translated into carbs are bad for you.
Right.
And that makes it very, very tricky. And part of the reason I really appreciate the work you're doing is we have to be those conduits in the middle.
Correct.
Because you can't take a foreign language and that translation, it's all about the translation. And the work that I've seen you do is you're able to translate very complex things into very basic things that people can understand. I saw some of your PowerPoints and the diagrams you have. It makes it so obvious for people to understand why this matters. So let's talk some controversy. Two things. First, everybody jumps on a low carb diet. Now there's two main varieties that comes in, right? One is the Atkins flavor, which is low carb, high protein.
Right.
And don't get me started on that from a kidney perspective.
Yeah, I know you have a lot to say about that.
Then there's the low carb ketogenic or low carb high fat perspective. What's your take on both of them? And sort of, the studies that are out there in terms of saying that they were effective, quote unquote, for weight loss. What do you say to that?
Yeah. Okay. This is one of my favorite subjects, actually, because low carbohydrate diets admittedly produce good results in the short term. They really do. And so it can be confusing if you, have talked with somebody who's eaten a low carbohydrate diet, or maybe you've done it yourself. Within a short period of time, oftentimes people who do this end up benefiting from it, right? So let's take somebody who's eating a standard American diet. Okay, they're eating a standard American diet. Their protein intake is probably somewhere around 20% of total calories, maybe 25%. Their fat intake is somewhere about 40% of total calories, and their carbohydrate intake is somewhere about 40%. Okay, so they've been eating this way for years. And what ends up happening over the course of time is most people who eat a standard American diet end up developing some combination of chronic conditions. It could be high blood glucose and or prediabetes. It could be, the beginning stages of chronic kidney disease. It could be fatty liver disease. It could be some version of autoimmune disease. It could be some, high cholesterol, hypertension, atherosclerosis, you name it. It could be any or all of those. So an individual who's been eating a standard American diet for some period of time could end up developing one or more of these chronic conditions. And then at that point, they end up switching over to try and quote unquote clean up their diet. So if they choose a low carbohydrate diet, what they often find is that a low carbohydrate diet is a very effective, rapid weight loss tool. And when I first saw the data on how effective low carbohydrate diets, or ketogenic diets, if you will, are at promoting weight loss, I almost didn't believe it. And when I sort of, learned empirical story after story after story, and then read more in the research, I started to realize that, okay, great. There's a very sort of like complex, two-way signaling mechanism that happens between your digestive system and your brain that controls your appestat, and it decreases your total desire to consume food when you're eating a diet that's high in fat and or high in protein. And as a result of that, you can get away with eating these foods, and you actually lower your appetite. You end up becoming somewhat calorie restricted, and as a result of that, you end up losing weight. So when I saw this information, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Now, one of the things that Dr. Greger talks about as well is he says, listen, the most powerful way that you can improve your cholesterol is to lose weight. If you just lose weight, your cholesterol is going to come down, okay? But in addition to that, if you lose weight, guess what else is going to come down? Your blood pressure. Your triglyceride values are probably going to come down. Your A1C value, your fasting blood glucose, your fasting insulin level. Okay, so what people who end up, eating a low carbohydrate diet, whether it's an Atkins diet or whether it's a ketogenic diet, what they experience is all of that. They get a reduction in body weight, which then is the first domino in a whole series of dominoes that unfolds in their favor, reducing many of these biomarkers that would otherwise be elevated. So over the course of the first 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, they see all this improvement. And then they go get their blood work and they go, oh my God, this is working. This is fantastic. I feel great. I've lost 47 pounds and my blood pressure is normal. My A1C is normal. And my doctor says that I don't have diabetes anymore. So you pat them on the back. You say, hey, this is really good stuff. So the medical world sees this all the time. They say, okay, great. Person tries low carbohydrate diet, lose weight, end up improving many biomarkers. That's the solution. The problem is that over the course of time, okay, time is a sort of a relative metric, but it could be 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 2 years, 5 years, 15 years, 20 years into the future. There's plenty of scientific data to demonstrate that people who consume higher fat diets, higher protein diets, and especially higher animal food diets end up developing more chronic diseases. The risk for hypertension goes up. The risk for chronic kidney disease goes up. The risk for fatty liver disease goes up. The risk for type 2 diabetes goes up. So it's almost like a U-shaped curve, right? At the beginning, you get sort of a reduction in many biomarkers and weight loss. And then at a certain point, you hit a plateau. And then when that plateau is achieved, oftentimes there's an increase in body weight and an increase in many of these other biomarkers that initially came down. And so what I encourage people to do is I say, listen, you have to pay attention to what's going to happen to you in the long term. You cannot be blinded to the long-term effects of what you're doing simply because the short-term effects are good. You have to pay attention to both of those. And when you do, a plant-based diet becomes an obvious solution.
Absolutely. What you hit on that's really interesting is when I reviewed all of the literature around these topics on low carb diets, the magic number in literature is 6 months. So anytime you see a study that lasted 6 months or less on weight loss,
Mhm.
it's really not worth the paper that it's printed on. When you extend those studies out to 1 year or 2 year, you find the dropout rates in both ketogenic and low carb are substantial. But if you
Absolutely.
look at people who end up adopting more of a whole foods plant-based diet, and I distinguish whole foods from vegan, and the reason I say that is you can eat potato chips all day and call yourself a vegan. That's great, but then you're going to end up in all sorts of troubles. But if you look at a whole foods plant-based diet, it's sustainable. And not only that, if you look at across the world, the longest living people in the world, they eat a predominant whole foods plant-based diet. They don't even know what the word means. The things that they do, and you can look at this and you can say, if you wanted to be a basketball player, you'd want to look at who's the top person. In my case, I grew up watching Michael Jordan. I'd want to know exactly what he does every single day. This is somebody who's done it. What's his work ethic like? It's funny that people look for such quick solutions. And when they do low carbs, what's really scary is the second you expose them back to sugars, you can actually see their bloodstream starting to show the lining of their endothelial vessels. The cells are dying, breaking apart, filling up the blood. And all that happens because you go back. And the ketogenic idea, the dilemma that we're faced with is even in as little as just a few months on it, you start to see insulin resistance develop very, very rapidly. Fatty livers, which I tell you, in the coming storm on healthcare organizations, especially like mine, we're dealing with patients who have fatty livers going on to cirrhosis. It's not Hep C, it's not HIV, it's not other stuff. It's actually fatty liver that's becoming one of the predominant things causing people to get on transplant lists for essentially what could be a completely avoidable thing.
Yeah. And so you think just like I do, which is that eating a ketogenic diet, let's say this, eating a low carbohydrate diet, whether it's a ketogenic diet that's again high fat, low or medium protein, or whether it's an Atkins diet, which is high fat, higher protein, both of those scenarios cause the perfect storm for excess fat accumulation in your liver, excess fat accumulation in your muscle, and excess fat accumulation in your vasculature. And when you have a combination of excess fat, especially saturated fat that's accumulating inside of your liver and or your muscle and or your vasculature, it's just a ticking time bomb. At a certain point, you're going to develop vascular problems. You're going to develop kidney problems. You're going to develop liver problems, and you're going to develop muscle problems. And muscle, when it comes to this topic, muscle overaccumulation of fatty acids inside of muscle tissue is insulin resistance, which increases your risk for diabetes. And you were one of the first people that actually pointed this out to me that blew my mind. You said the more saturated fat you eat, the higher your risk for albuminuria,
Mhm.
right?
Absolutely.
And number two, that total protein is linked with total mortality. Those are two things that I didn't actually understand until I heard you speak. And
Yeah,
so some combination of consuming too much of those two nutrients can lead to disaster down the road.
it's this weird thing about whenever people try to take one macro down, what they don't realize is what are you replacing that macronutrient with? You start to take carbohydrates down. If carbohydrates were truly that bad for you, evolution over millions of years, when we look at how plants actually formed and everything else, why would we have plants in the first place?
Correct.
There's this whole concept that people are missing is we feel like if now we get rid of all carbohydrates, somehow we're doing ourselves justice. There's a fascinating study that looked at, and this is where I'm so glad I'm no longer an intern or a first year grad student, because these poor souls have to do the craziest thing. So in this study,
Uh-huh.
what they looked at was they wanted to see, could whole foods, especially whole grains, could they cause weight loss? So they fed these guys refined grains and they fed these guys whole grains. And then what they did was they had these interns collect their stool samples. And then they would burn the stool samples to see how much energy they contain. And what was fascinating was a few things. First, if you ate whole grains, a lot more of the energy actually went right through your body into the stool. So when they burned it, it had a lot more energy in it. Number two was that when they measured the bacteria inside your gut, of course, you were creating all this beautiful diversity going on throughout it. And then number three was when they looked at weight loss, just that simple change of switching to whole grains was actually increasing the thermogenic effect of food. So the TEE also went up. So you got TEE, you got the fact that you're actually not absorbing the same amount of calories, you got this beautiful microbiome diversity. we still can't find why people are so afraid of it when the literature says repeatedly how good it is.
Mhm. I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I everything you say is absolutely true. Um, Also, in addition to going back to what you had also said a couple of minutes ago, you said the people who consume a ketogenic diet, they end up, they lower their carbohydrate intake and their glucose resolves. So their glucose comes down rather than being elevated in the fasting and postprandial state. Their glucose normalizes. All of a sudden, their A1C comes down, and they on a piece of paper they look like they don't have diabetes anymore. Okay, but just like you said, if you consume something that's carbohydrate rich in that metabolic setting, as soon as you do that, all of a sudden, boom, your blood glucose goes through the roof and your insulin production spikes, right? And that can cause a whole collection of adverse events in your gut microbiome and beyond. And so I think one of the things that kind of sort of to pull this whole thing together, one of the things that gets a little bit confusing here is that you have the effects that you just described here when you're consuming a plant-based diet, that you end up wasting more energy into the toilet because the thermic effect of food has gone up and there's actually more there's more undigested food material inside of the toilet. And then in addition to that, it promotes weight loss and it promotes improved kidney function and beyond. Okay. But then on the other hand, you have people who empirically say, oh, but if I eat a low carbohydrate diet, I end up losing weight and I feel great. Right. And that is the truth. People do end up feeling great. But what they don't realize is that in the carbohydrate avoidance game, it looks, when you put on the carbohydrate avoidance goggles and you operate in that mentality, as long as you don't challenge your digestive system or challenge your liver or challenge your pancreas to metabolize anything that contains a significant amount of carbohydrate in one meal. Okay, this is otherwise known as a glucose challenge or a carbohydrate challenge. As long as that is not present, then your blood glucose will be nice and flat, and your cholesterol levels will be nice and flat, and you're going to get the impression that you're actually heart disease proof or you're diabetes proof. But then the minute you eat a carbohydrate challenge, in the clinical setting, you can go get an oral glucose tolerance test, an OGTT, where they will literally give you a solution that contains 75 grams worth of carbohydrates or worth of dextrose, which is glucose. You drink that, and then they monitor your blood glucose levels over the course of the next 2 to 3 hours, right? And people who are in a ketogenic setting or people who are in the Atkins setting in a low carbohydrate scenario, as soon as they drink that 75 grams worth of glucose in water, guess what happens to their blood glucose? It goes through the roof. It goes through the roof. And, their blood glucose ends up climbing well beyond 130, 150, 200, 250, 300 sometimes. And then as a result of that, the amount of insulin that their pancreas has to secrete is extremely large. So they become hyperglycemic and hyperinsulinemic immediately, right? And that's the problem, is that they think that they have actually resolved diabetes. They think that they're no longer insulin resistant, but in reality, what they're doing is they are insulin resistant. It's just in dormancy. It's there. You just don't see it until you challenge your digestive system with one meal that contains anything greater than usually about 50 grams of carbohydrate. As soon as you do that, you'll see exactly that your digestive system, your liver, your pancreas are not equipped to be able to handle carbohydrate energy. And as soon as that happens, that's a strong indicator that you're living in an insulin resistant state. And insulin resistance is the central node that increases your risk for all chronic diseases that I know of. Period. End of story.
And what's fascinating about what you just said, and probably a point that everybody forgets, is when people do things like low carb or they're doing ketogenic variation or Atkins or a modified Atkins and so forth, they do cheat days. And what the data shows is exactly what you just described. So I think it's really important to stress it again is if you do 6 days of one of these diets and then you do a cheat days, that cheat day does significant amount of damage to your body. And those microvascular complications, you're destroying the lining of your endothelial cells and all of that damage accumulates. So it's even worse when you try to cheat on these diets because of the fact that your body can't handle the sugar that you put into it. And that's really, really key is if you take on one of these diets and you got a wedding plan coming up, so that's why you're going to do it, and then you'll eat healthy. It doesn't work. In fact, in the long run, it's going to do you far greater damage to do this yo-yo cycle than to really adopt the way you're describing, which is if you switch to a healthy, minimally processed, whole foods, plant-based diet, you're going to do fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah, you hit it on the head. It's still always sort of like, it's confusing to me, and I don't have the answer fully as to why sometimes there's so much resistance to integrating a plant-based diet. And I understand that it's, if you enjoy eating meat, you enjoy drinking milk, and you enjoy eating cheese, you kind of view it from the perspective of like, well, I have to give those foods up, right? And then I got to eat more plant material. And you know what? I don't like eating broccoli. I don't like eating bananas. It's not tasty, right? But yet, when presented with the evidence, the weight of evidence that a plant-based diet is truly not just a management technique, but an actual reversal mechanism for so many chronic diseases, it still blows my mind that a wide, segment of the population isn't just flocking to a plant-based diet and doing it immediately.
I'll tell you why. And this is based on World War II. In World War II, the concept was we wanted an edge for our soldiers. And so there was this huge push in subsidizing meat. And if you were a homemaker and you didn't have meat on the plate, you were doing harm to the country. That's how this whole concept started. And so all of this subsidy led to the fact that then there was so much milk that was being produced. And as milk was being produced, they had nowhere to go with it. So then they're like, okay, we got all this milk, we got all these cows. What do? That came the cheese era. Then it became all about the cheeses and pushing forward on the cheeses. And all of the marketing was milk does a body good. Meat is associated with masculinity. Meat is associated with strength. And all of those things, some of the stuff that we've seen, like the movies come out like Game Changers. Finally, we're able to show athletes who are following a whole foods plant-based diet. And there's stereotypes of what a vegan is, of what somebody who practices a whole foods plant-based diet is. We don't have enough role models in the past, but now we got guys like yourselves who are athletes. We got all of these celebrities who have switched, who are already athletes. So the world is changing, but those stigmas still stick. And what's fascinating about the meat industry is since the 70s, red meat consumption in this country has steadily gone down. People always think it's the red meat that's bad. It's actually not the red meat anymore that's a big problem. Pork is about the same, it's increased a little bit, but it's chicken. Chicken consumption has drastically increased in this country. And if you look at what they do to these baby chicks, there's only 4 major companies that make them. You have to buy the baby chicks from them. You have to buy the feed they consume from them. And all the labels such as, they were allowed to be free range. Well, they can't be free range because they're breeded to grow so big that they end up having hip fractures that they can't stand up.
Wow.
So the baby chicks, that the way that the chicken is ready to go to the slaughterhouses, they're having heart attacks. Their breasts are so big that they're getting the chickens are getting heart failures and heart attacks.
Unbelievable.
And that's why when people are consuming this stuff, the amount of cholesterol that they're getting in chickens, the amount of modifications that these chickens have had simply to rapidly grow is fascinating. And it's inhumane on every single level. So when they talk about no antibiotics, well, you may say it's no antibiotics, but you have breeded these guys in a certain way. And that makes all the difference. So all of these marketing gimmicks that are going on, people don't see through it. But the data shows that it's actually chicken that's become the bigger problem now. Red meat overall, every single year, the consumption is going down. And that's why they're now switching over to cheese. The big marketing ploy is we don't need that much meat. So what do we do with all of these livestock? It's all about chicken, and it's all about dairy and cheese. And what's fascinating is if you look at the history of livestock, what did they feed livestock? When they were feeding them corn, they were getting more infections. They were getting all sorts of diseases. So they started feeding them soy. So it's funny, we talk about soy protein and we say soy protein is bad. In fact, in kidney disease, it's probably the safest protein that you can have when it comes to protecting your kidneys from getting worse. But the soy protein, what they found was cows would actually grow bigger, cows would be healthier, they would actually do better, and the meat was better quality. So soy was good enough to be fed to every livestock that we were eating. Yet, when it comes to putting food directly in our body, no, we can't have soy.
No, soy's bad for you.
Yes.
Right. And then there's this propaganda that soy is going to increase your risk for breast cancer. Soy is going to increase your risk for prostate cancer. So don't have any soy. And again, it's unfortunately, it's just propaganda. It's just marketing. And it's kind of sort of like helped brainwash a lot of people. But you're, in other words, what you're saying about white meat being more problematic than red meat is that, white meat is the new red meat to a certain extent because you're consuming more of it. And the conditions inside of these domesticated farms has deteriorated to the point where now the actual cholesterol content of the meat itself has gone up over the course of time. Recipe for disaster.
It absolutely is. This is all fascinating. So let me ask you, in your mastering diabetes method, what is it that you teach, especially for the people watching, if they want to just get started, what are some things they can do? And of course, we'll share the links and everything so people can come to you and really learn from you directly. But just to kind of give them an idea, where do they start?
I appreciate that. Okay, so the Mastering Diabetes method basically has 4 components to it. The first one is a whole food plant-based diet, a low-fat plant-based whole food diet. Okay, when I say low-fat, I'm saying you somewhere between, if the total amount of fat in your diet is somewhere between approximately 10% and approximately 15% of total calories, that is what we classify as a low-fat diet. So that's the first one. The second one is daily movement. Okay, I'm not talking about, having to go do a high intensity interval class. I'm not talking about going to CrossFit unless you want to. I'm literally talking about using your body and moving your body and challenging your musculature in some way, shape, or form every single day for approximately 30 minutes at the minimum. Okay. The third is documentation. Documentation using a tool that we've developed called the decision tree. And in other words, you don't even have to use that. The idea here is that people living with diabetes or pre-diabetes strongly benefit from writing things down on a piece of paper. And there's so many gadgets and apps and devices that you can buy in today's world that help. But what we have found is that the power of using a pen or a pencil far outweighs any of that. And it seems old school in today's world, but that's okay. And we have a sort of very specific method by which we suggest that you write down your blood glucose, the food that you're eating, some simple information about what's in that food. And you kind of do a chronological assessment of what's happening over the course of a 24-hour period. And when you do this repeatedly, you start to recognize patterns. And as soon as you recognize those patterns, then you say, oh, I see the cause and effect relationship between what I'm doing and what it's resulting in. So that's a huge component of our method. And then the fourth component is intermittent fasting. And we recommend that intermittent fasting is something that, not everybody has to perform intermittent fasting, but there's a lot of people who would benefit from intermittent fasting, whether it's a, weekly 24-hour intermittent fast or a daily 16-hour intermittent fast. There's a time and place for intermittent fasting, and it's something that, the research world has shown to be very effective at helping to improve or reduce the risk for many cardiovascular and diabetes-related complications. So the primary focus is a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet. In other words, you could write everything down, you can move your body all day long, and you can perform intermittent fasting, and you're probably going to get healthier. But if you're not eating a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet, then you're missing the biggest puzzle piece. Okay, that is without question, the biggest puzzle piece, because we find that people who make just that change by itself with nothing else, literally just change the food that they're eating and become more plant focused. Again, don't have to be a vegan, don't have to be vegetarian. I'm just asking you to increase your quantity of plant material. And when you do that, there are so many benefits that come along for the ride that people who are living with any form of diabetes who have elevated fasting or post-meal blood glucose end up seeing very quick results. When I say very quick results, the results can start to unfold in as little as 24 hours, as what happened in my case, as little as 48 hours, or as long as a week, right? And that's actually mind-blowing because you develop diabetes and pre-diabetes over the course of many years. Okay, it's not something that just sort of happens to you, immediately. So, pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes development can sometimes take 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And when you transition to a plant-strong diet, you start to see resolution of those symptoms, not on the scale of years, not even on the scale of months. You start to see resolution of many of those symptoms within the scale of weeks, if not days. And that's one of the 1,000 reasons why I think that the human body is just an unbelievably exquisite machine, because it can tolerate a lot of damage over the course of time. And as soon as you start to feed it the right material, all of a sudden, boom, now your chances of improving your health go up, and they go up really quickly.
And it's amazing. You know, the same thing applies to human spirit. You know, you can get
Yeah,
beaten down throughout your life and you can bounce back.
so true.
This is a fascinating conversation. You know, I guess what I would say to people who are watching is really, no matter where you are in life, no matter what you've gone through, there's always hope to get better. It ain't over
Always.
till it's over. So if you had to bring all of this together and
Mhm.
sort of give people, you know, a few tips to walk away from this interview today and say, you know, wherever you are, take
Mhm.
these 2 or 3 things and start there, what would you say?
Okay, this is a great question. So here's what I would say: if you're new to this idea of eating a plant-based diet, what I would recommend, the first thing that I'd recommend that you do is find a way to eat 5 servings of plant-based foods per day. Okay. Now, when I say 5 servings of plant-based foods, I literally mean you can eat some combination of fruits, legumes, being lentils, beans, or lentils, beans, or peas. Thank you. Um, or starchy vegetables, or whole grains. Okay. So from those 4, categories, in addition to that, sorry, let me back up. Fruits, starchy vegetables, legumes, whole grains. Those are the carbohydrate-rich, plant-based foods. In addition to that, you also have mushrooms. You also have green leafy vegetables. And you also have non-starchy vegetables. So choose from any of that. Just find a way to get 5 servings of those foods into your diet on a daily basis. Once you do that for a week. Do that for 2 weeks. Just get really comfortable with having that material inside of your diet. Then, over the course, the next thing that I recommend doing is taking that 5 and turning it into 10. And that right there, that process could take another month. It's fine. There's no rush. Okay. So what we're trying to do is sort of displace non-plant material with plant material, but I don't recommend that you make the transition quickly. I really don't recommend you do that. And the reason why I don't recommend that is actually multiple fold. Number one, if you're taking medication for blood pressure and or you're taking insulin and or you're taking oral diabetes medications, within a short period of time, those medication dosages can become too much. And you can actually develop low blood pressure. You can develop hypoglycemia. Both of those are life-threatening. So do not, do everything you can to transition slowly. Okay. So phase 1 is 5 fruits or vegetables or plant-based material per day. The second one would be 10. Phase 3 would be 15 servings of plant-based material. When you get to 15, if you're not already feeling like $1,000,000, if you already haven't lost weight, if you already, aren't bouncing off the walls, trying to go outside and use all this newfound energy that you have, then I would be shocked. Okay. Literally, it can be that simple. The next thing that I would put into play is I would find a way to get 30 minutes of daily movement. Okay. In the world of, nutrition and in the world of diabetes, I tend to talk a lot about food. I tend to talk a lot about food because food is it's a language. It's a universal language, and it's a medium that everybody has to be putting into their mouth every single day, on most days. But exercise and moving your body is so profoundly powerful for your cardiovascular system, for your liver, for your kidney, for your muscle tissue, for your sexual organs, for your brain, for your thyroid gland, for your vasculature, you name it. The number of effects and the magnitude of change that can happen when you use your body on a daily basis is mind-boggling. We're talking about it can literally rewire neurons inside of your brain. You can manufacture new nervous tissue when you use your muscles. You can reshape and reform your cardiovascular system. You can decrease your risk, and you can reverse chronic kidney disease. You can reverse fatty liver disease. You can resolve many autoimmune conditions simply by moving your body more. So if you haven't already incorporated daily movement into your daily regimen, I would recommend doing that either, in parallel with a transition to a plant-based diet, or maybe as step 4 after you've gotten to about 15 plant foods per day, And the combination of the two of those, I think, can completely transform you from the inside out. And if it doesn't, then I don't know what I'm talking about.
Well, this is phenomenal. I want to thank you so much for today. I learned a lot, and that's awesome. I'm always looking to learn, and I can't wait to have you back and go into more details on these topics. For everybody watching, we're going to have the links to all your information below. You can definitely order the book. It's available on Amazon. I'll have the link to that as well. But we would love to have you back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hashmi. I really appreciate it.